Thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome.
So our last question, Denise sent in a question. It's really funny because one of the very first episodes that we recorded together was the series, What is a Man and What is a Woman? And something happened and the audio got corrupted. And so we weren't able to publish it, which ended up being a blessing in disguise because it was not a very well articulated conversation. It was more of a heated debate. And we had a really hard time. I personally had a really hard time coping with our differences in opinions and how all of us feel about women's role in ministry and like God's purpose for women and things like that. I'm so thankful that now, after literally almost like we're weeks away from 2 years, I'm so thankful that we get the chance to talk about this a little bit. So Denise, thank you for poking us to make a conversation about this. I want to lead by saying that I have a certificate in ministry for women from Moody, and my education focused a lot on if women should be in ministry leadership and if women should teach and what a woman's role is in the family, what a woman's role is in the church, in society. And so I have a very good overview picture of what the different viewpoints are. And I think our goal here is really just to present information, not really set a set stance, because Cody believes something different than I believe, and Ben believes something different than both of us believe. And we haven't reached a consensus on what a woman's role is. So we're going to present some information. I'll read the question. We'll have a good, loving conversation that stays calm. And then if it's not satisfying, or if you have additional follow-up questions as a listener, please reach out, because I know this is sensitive and this is something that we want to approach with sensitivity. So the question is there any text in the Bible that prevents Jewish women from teaching the Torah, the Talmud, or any other piece of scripture for that matter? I know that God only called men to take care of the temple, like to be a high priest, for example, but I'm not sure about women being allowed to teach in other positions. So I took this in the educational direction, and I started wanting to outline that. Denise, I'll send you this outline because there's a lot of resources we're not going to mention in this episode. However, if anybody else would like this outline, I'm happy to send it to you as well. Just send us an email or contact us on our website. Understanding the emotional response to limitations on women's roles in leadership is where I want to start, because at my church where I used to work in ministry, we literally had guys like march in to the center of the lobby and start screaming that women teaching was an abomination unto God, and to get them off the stage and make this huge issue that police had to be called and they got dragged out in handcuffs. And I saw that happen more than once. I had a situation one time where a gentleman threatened the female staff at the church, and we all had to be escorted in and out of the building because he was that vehemently against women even having jobs in the church, even if it was outside of pastoral ministry. So this is inflammatory. This is something we know people react very passionately to. There are a ton of interpretations on what women's roles should be, and I want to approach this sensitively, especially because I'm a woman and I'm more conservative in my approach. Do we think that this is something that is better to make a rib issue or a spine issue?
So I would say, regardless of where you stand on this issue, it is definitely a rib issue and not a spine issue. I don't think someone is going to go to hell just because she happens to be a woman and gets behind the pulpit and gives a message.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay. So we all agree that this is a rib issue, not a spine issue. And that's important because it's not a hill that I'm going to die on. Okay, so my next question then to pose to the group, is it okay to ignore what some people say is biblical just because we don't feel like it makes sense to us?
No, it's not good to ignore something. Like, we have to confront issues where they arise.
Yeah, we can, just because we don't agree or don't like something or don't understand something in the Bible doesn't mean we can ignore it.
So then what do we do when we're faced with somebody saying, the Bible says a woman can't teach? what do we do if it doesn't make sense to us? Because there have been people who have said women shouldn't teach at all. And that would mean that what I'm doing is biblically wrong. Just even though I'm with my husband, it's wrong. So what do we do? Do we leave our church? Do we lash out publicly? Do we start our own church or ministry that aligns with what our own personal convictions state? How do we differentiate somebody's personal interpretation as biblical authority?
First, and I know it's a stock answer, but everything that we do should be done in prayer, not out of anger or frustration. You may be righteously angry about something, but we're always called to have self-control. It's one of the fruit of the Spirit. And speaking of the fruit of the Spirit, one of the ways that you can gauge if you're right on a subject is to view the fruit of your church. Let's say that you happen to be in a church and the church is more egalitarian. What is the fruit of your church? And in order for you to gauge that, you have to be very brutally honest with yourself and brutally honest about what you have to be willing to dig a little bit. You have to really look at what the church is producing. How are they influencing their community? How is the level of peace amongst the congregants, amongst the laity, so to speak? Is everyone getting along? And just because there's strife doesn't mean that there's a problem with leadership necessarily. But when there are conflicts, the conflicts arise for a reason. So what are the conflicts in your church? Is it all just entirely to do with the fact that there are women in leadership? Is it because they're egalitarian? And then on the flip side, if you happen to be in a church where it's very aggressively patriarchal or complementarian, if you're in that position, same questions. What is the fruit of that? Are you better off because there's no women anywhere? Just throwing women out of everything doesn't automatically make your church better. So how exactly is your church doing? My position here is really that. What is the fruit? And to be fair, and I may be showing my hand a little bit here, what I've seen from a lot of churches that have caved significantly and have full female pastors, not women with the title of pastor, and pastor can be ambiguous, but I'm talking about head pastorship, as in ordained women who are in official positions of church leadership. What I tend to see is that the church kind of goes downhill. And that in like the Presbyterian church, they have ordained female ministers, and you've seen, and you don't even have to connect this with their downfall because they've been on a downward track for a while. But if this was the right move, why didn't it correct the church? Why is it that ordaining female ministers didn't immediately cause them to do a 180 because this is what God wanted them to do? And that also, just to be fair, we are the logic of God. It doesn't logically follow that that means it was the wrong decision. However, it also doesn't mean it was the right decision. It seems to indicate that it wasn't. So, all that is to say, you have to look at the fruit. What is this causing in your church?
So I want to take a second to break down some of those big words that you shared, the complementarian, egalitarian. So let's go over those fancy names. So complementarianism is a theological view that affirms the equal dignity and worth of men and women, while also asserting that God has ordained distinct and complementary roles for them in the home, church, and society. It emphasizes both equality and difference, with the understanding that men and women are created in the image of God, but have unique strengths and responsibilities. This is definitely a spectrum that I see more nuance in than egalitarianism. When it swings into egalitarianism, which I'll explain in a second, you see a lot more like wild things in women's ministry. So complementarianism does not believe in female leadership in the home or the church. So they hold to male headship of the home and church. Males take on roles of leadership and authority. Women take on roles of being supportive and nurturing. Women generally do not teach men, or if women do teach, it is with the assistance or presence of a man, especially her husband. And women can teach other women and children. Complementarianism can get taken to disrespectful extremes. I've personally experienced that. And denominations that generally endorse complementarianism would be the Southern Baptist Convention, the Evangelical Free Church of America, Calvary Chapel, and independent Bible churches. There are biblical justifications for this viewpoint. Funnily enough, egalitarians tend to use some of the same verses as complementarians to justify their viewpoint. So you can see there's differences in interpretation of the same scriptures. So egalitarianism would be the opposite of complementarianism. So the theological view that all people are equal in worth and have the same potential to serve God and others in the church and beyond, regardless of gender or any other characteristic. It opposes the idea of inherent differences in worth or calling between genders, arguing that gender should not limit ministry opportunities so women can be ordained and teach in all capacities, lead in all capacities. Denominations that generally endorse this were Quakers, United Methodists, Eco-Presbyterians, Northern Baptists, Church of the Nazarene, Wesleyan churches, the Salvation Army, and more. A lot of non-denominational churches as well. Our current church is a good example, though, of like being a standout because they are Eco-Presbyterian, but they do not necessarily believe in the ordination of women. So you just never know what you're going to get. It varies church by church. So I can throw a label out there, but every church leader operates differently, even with different doctrinal beliefs. And then the mutualist viewpoint is also known as soft complementarianism. It's not commonly adopted or even known. I know about it because I studied it in college. This is where I fall. I don't really like taking a hard stance of either. I think they're both too extreme. I've seen them be too extreme. And so I much prefer the mutualist approach, which emphasizes ontological equality between men and women, according to Galatians 3:28, but sees mutual submission, seen in Ephesians 5:21, as a key to interpreting roles. Leadership is not exclusive to men, but roles should be discerned based on gifting, calling, things like that, not gender alone. I like that a lot better than I like the just generic, oh, anyone can be a pastor, or no, go bake cookies and play with the children. That's your role. I don't like either. I don't know. I wanted to outline the function and the definition of each word and where you can see them played out before we really argue any of these kind of things. Because I know, Denise, your question was about the Jewish church historically, but this is something that plays out today and it's very common. And it's one of those arguments like in Joanne's question of, are we for it? Are we against it? Do we know? That churches have a really hard time outlining.
Yeah, so I looked a little bit into Jewish tradition on this one. Obviously, the high priest roles were specifically for men, only men, but even more defined than that, only Levites. So Levites were the only priests, and they were all men. That did not dismiss women from teaching or having roles of leadership, though, in the Jewish culture. That comes more later in rabbinic teachings. You can see Deborah is mentioned as a prophetess. Miriam leads worship and is also mentioned as a prophetess. The Proverbs wife is told to lead and teach with wisdom. So there are different examples of women in leadership in the Old Testament Jewish culture, just not in the high priest setting. But that was also very limited for men too.
Yeah.
The trouble with leadership is that by its nature, you're not going to get a lot of people in it. And as we've discussed before, there are a lot of men currently in leadership who do not belong there. It's every 5 minutes someone decides they're going to start a new church because their church hurt and they need to go off on their own way and right every wrong. Or they're going to be the one that brings the churching to the masses. They're the one who's going to get it all done. But then they end up doing the exact same thing that everyone else does. I think the actual gift of leadership is fairly rare. And I think I even said that in one of the, I do believe leadership itself is a spiritual gift that God gives to people, and it's exceedingly rare. Now, I do also happen to believe that it's one primarily given to men. My position that we actually argued in the episode we didn't end up publishing is I do believe that God can raise leaders up out of both men and women. However, it's much more commonly men than women. The reason that I believe that is, in one, because men are called to be leaders of their own households, and they're called to be the spiritual head of their homes. The Bible talks about how in the very beginning there's Adam and Eve. Adam is the man who sinned, and we're told that through Adam all sinned. He's held to a greater level of account for the sin that happened in the beginning than Eve is. That doesn't mean that Eve holds no culpability. It's that Adam's responsibility was greater because he's the husband. So there's a lot of that kind of talk that you see throughout the Old Testament and also the New, where as the combined body, the man is the head. Now, that doesn't mean that the woman has no responsibility. And I think that there are a lot of people on the patriarchal side, or even like the heavier complementarian side, who try to erase all authority that women have. The Proverbs 31 woman is very clearly not a weak woman. She has authority over her own household. And also she has authority over her husband's body, just as the husband has authority over her body. There's a lot of authority that women have. They also have authority over children. Children, obey your parents, plural, in the Lord, for this is right. So women have authority over their children. To this day, my mom still has a measure of authority over me. And if you really think about it, that sounds unfair. What, because someone gave birth to me, I'm under their thumb forever? No, that's a stupid way to look at it. But that's a way you could reframe that. But that's not what the Bible is teaching. I give her respect and I give her deference, and I listen to her counsel always because she birthed me. So you see that there are disparate levels of authority given in every section. The Levites were given a disparate amount of authority to the rest of the Israelites. That sounds unfair. That's the reality. And only men could be the high priests of the Levites. That's not fair. Okay. God doesn't give the same amount of authority to literally everyone. We have to accept that before going forward, even if we disagree. And there genuinely is a good amount of disagreement that is healthy on this. And I'm not saying that I have this all figured out or that I'm 100% right. I have my position that I'm willing to defend, but I'm not going to die on this hill. This isn't a hill worth dying on.
And it has nothing to do with Ben's respect for women.
Absolutely not.
So the opinion that he takes, I don't hold the same opinion, and Cody doesn't hold the same opinion. We all three, we cannot agree.
No.
And the thing about that I love is that we can learn from each other. And so I've prepared a couple of questions that we can ask when analyzing the function of a woman in ministry and how we feel about it. And this is to encourage the listener to come to their own conclusion rather than us enforcing our opinions, because ultimately we're going based on our own personal Bible study that we've interpreted with whatever resources we had, plus personal experience. And I can say I'm not impressed by women's ministry. That's why I pursued it. And so I want to ask a couple of questions. First and foremost, what is the highest level of leadership that you are comfortable allowing a woman to have? And what is the highest level of leadership you as a woman are willing to allow yourself to have? Those are questions that I ask myself. And I will say that I do not feel called in any way, shape, or form to have pastoral leadership be one of my titles. So I think some women feel very called to lead in ministry. I don't know if feeling called is a good enough reason to become a leader in ministry. And I think giftedness can be confused as leadership qualities. So the gift of encouragement or the gift of kind of negotiating sometimes, or influence, where you influence culture in your church. There are certain gifts that people have, women have, being very social creatures sometimes, that get misinterpreted as leadership, and really they're more useful and they're more honoring in other capacities, because leadership is very overwhelming. And we shared that in our answer to Hunter when we talked about making the decision to go into ministry. So that is the first question. Do you guys have any thoughts on those questions?
As far as the highest level of authority in a church, I would be comfortable with a woman having. Generally, I would say that's deaconess. And there is some trouble defining exactly what that is, because it seems like everyone has a different interpretation of what that is. But Paul refers to Sister Phoebe as a deaconess in the New Testament. Deaconess is a position that existed at the time of Paul. And it seemed like a catch-all term for a woman acting in official capacity within the church. And it does inherently come with a measure of authority. Today, deacons and deaconesses are somewhat you can generally just call them prominent people in the church that do things within the church everybody knows. And they are important people. But as far as the highest level, like the head pastor, I would say no, I wouldn't be comfortable with that.
Any thoughts?
Scripture is explicit about there being an apostle of female gender, and that being Junia. Complementary individuals try to weasel their way out of that, saying it's really Junias, but even honest complementary scholars like Douglas Moo, he wrote the NIV on Romans. In chapter 16 of Romans, it is lexically impossible for it to be a male. There's overwhelming evidence that it is not. He still holds to complementarianism, but there are female apostles. At least one.
There you go. Yeah.
And also we named our youngest baby after her. Her middle name is Joanna. Okay, so the next question is, where did your ideology come from? Your pastor, a podcast, wink, wink, or how you were raised? You have to be really careful here, because if you have a very passionate pastor who's extremely conservative and outspoken against women being in any form of leadership, but he doesn't give you the biblical references for that, it can be dangerous for a woman to lose her voice when maybe she is truly called to do something with her faith. And that's where I've seen a lot of this sort of extreme emotional reactivity from men about women in leadership coming from is such and such a famous pastor hates it, and so I hate it. And it's okay, but why? So where did that come from? Where did your ideology come from? And then the next question is, the scriptures used to defend both views are conflicting and confusing. How can we interpret these verses to better understand what God says about women in leadership in churches?
Background study, I think, is a big one. Understanding cultural settings, as well as other literature at the time. The Gnostic movement popped up pretty quickly after the fact and ran away with some of Paul's teachings, and that led to the Gospel of Thomas saying that women couldn't even make it into heaven, that they had to be transformed into men before they could make it into heaven. So understanding the background of the culture of the time and how these have been misinterpreted since the very beginning and used incorrectly since the very beginning, and understanding that it is not an easy thing to interpret and go through, I think is important.
Any thoughts?
So I think ultimately what we really need to do is not start from a conclusion. And I think that's what pretty much everybody does, regardless of where you stand.
Thank you for saying that.
For me, initially, my position was a lot more egalitarian. If I'm honest, I don't want to take the position that I take. What I would like to say is, for everyone, yeah, anyone can be a leader in the church. That's what I would like to say. And that at one time is what I did say. In fact, I think, Cody, you remember, we were in a Bible study. There was another guy named Ben who asked us how we feel about female preachers. And I was like, yeah, I don't care. So my position now is a fairly recent development. And it's not one I like or I'm comfortable with, and I'm glad to be convinced of any other way if I can be. But I don't think the way that I was thinking initially was the right way. I looked at both my parents. I looked at my mom and my dad. I knew that I learned a lot from both of them. And at the time, I was going to a church that did have female pastors, and I didn't see anything wrong with it. And so I thought, I don't see anything wrong with it. And I've learned from women and men. So what's the problem?
Did I change your mind?
No.
But we don't have time to talk about it today.
We just don't have time. So going through more time with that church highlighted some of the issues with that for me, but also just reading the Bible and not just ignoring the things that it said and seeking some of the arguments and some of the things that I'd heard, like the cult of Artemis, I think, is one of the discussions that arises around this, and the talk about how women were prominent in the cult of Artemis and they were pushing men out. And so Paul was addressing that specific issue with the cult of Artemis, except a lot of the things that are said about the cult of Artemis literally never happened and weren't real. There's a lot of that kind of talk where people will bring forward things. And I'm not saying you take that position, Cody. You're a lot more well-read on this, and you don't have to fall into that. But a lot of the justification for female pastors led along those lines. We've just been misinterpreting Scripture this entire time. Or, Paul doesn't really mean that. He's only referring to one specific thing. And so I was generally happy to just stop there. Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. But I shouldn't have stopped there. And I should have genuinely been seeking what it was that Paul was trying to say. And that's what I'm actively doing. And like I said, I'm not willing to die on the hill that I'm currently at. This is my current understanding of the issue. And that's one of the reasons why I've changed so much on it and how I'm still willing to change on it. If it turns out that the egalitarian position, and I don't know that I would ever be fully egalitarian because I think there are just a lot of differences between men and women. But a more egalitarian position is one I'm willing to take if the evidence from the Bible backs it up. But we need to look at the Bible first. Set aside our own wants on what we want the Bible to say. And we all do want the Bible to say something. But we have to set that aside to find out what it's saying.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think questions you can ask if you lean one way or the other is if you're more egalitarian and you believe women should be in leadership, you should be asking, why were none of the 12 disciples women? Why were high priests not allowed to be women? Is there something wrong with men being the heads of the church? And if you're coming at it from a complementary side and you think women shouldn't be in leadership, you should be asking questions like, okay, is Christ truly the head and we're the bride as the church? So does that make us all equals? Is there really no male nor female, no Jew nor Greek? Does that make it okay to teach? Emphasizing that there were female leaders in the Bible. That could be an exception, not the rule. And questions like that, where you're tackling these from an honest position.
Yeah. So is personal conviction enough when considering entering ministry or pastoral leadership as a woman?
It's not enough as a man.
I say no. I have had so many experiences where, okay, I'm just going to list the experiences. So I've seen a woman get ordained because she was jealous of her husband getting ordained. And so she had to run and get ordained because her husband did it and she felt like there was an imbalance and that needed to be corrected. And the only thing that would fix it was becoming ordained. I've seen a woman become ordained because her husband was the head pastor of a megachurch and she felt unqualified to share with her church body outside of being ordained. I've seen pastors, female pastors, become ordained because there was a great need in the church and they had care pastors that were exclusively men and there were women's issues that needed handled. And so they ordained a completely underqualified woman to be the care pastor for the females very quickly, which I didn't agree with. So those are just a couple of examples of where I've seen women get ordained inappropriately. And I think that happens a lot. You don't really hear a lot about women going to seminary for 8 years and mastering theology and speaking biblical languages and doing the things that I've seen male scholars doing. Female scholarship is completely different and it's very lacking. And even my experience in Moody myself as a college student in ministry was really disappointing, seeing some of the things that women were saying in terms of their goals, the reasons why they were doing what they were doing. I think I've met one female pastor ever that had a very prestigious degree and she knew what she was talking about most of the time. And it's not just exclusive to females, it's male and females, but they don't even read their Bibles. Like they couldn't even tell you like what the Bible says about some important things. And they confess in private to people that they look up to. Yeah, I've never read the Bible all the way through.
Yeah, and that goes to the male side too. Mm-hmm. Our current climate for colleges, what I've learned at Moody is not preparing me to be a pastor. And I'm doing a biblical studies major, but the first 3 years of classes is the same. They're the gen eds for Moody. Everybody takes them. And then there's some preaching classes that I've also taken as open electives that are on the pastor track. So I've done a lot of what they consider preparing church leadership, and none of it has prepared me for leadership. Like none of that would prepare anybody for leadership. And today's day and age, we're handing ordinations out like Oprah Winfrey. Like everybody can get ordained now.
You can take a 6-month online course and get ordained in Florida. So it's not hard and you don't have to know your Bible.
Yeah, and I think Ben had mentioned earlier in the episode of the mass droves to Catholicism and to Orthodoxy. And I think one of the reasons is they have very strict rules on ordination and what you have to know to even become a part of that position, to be put into that position, as it should be. Like you should not just step into a pastoral role not knowing anything.
No, that care pastor that I told you guys about, yeah, she had a person commit suicide on her watch. And I never recovered from that. So I don't know how she could have possibly recovered from that because she didn't have any Bible knowledge. Like it is like pastoral ministry. We've shared it before, but it's life or death. And you have people counting on you and putting you on a false pedestal that Jesus belongs on. And it's not right. And I think we seek and get addicted to that attention rather than putting God on the actual seat of authority. So the one other thing I wanted to say about personal conviction is that I think we confuse like anger with conviction. And I say that because, especially as a woman, so there's this great book called Eve in Exile. It is a book that is pro-complementarian, meaning that they do not believe that women belong in church leadership, at least not in a very high capacity. And I love that book because it goes into how feminism started and why feminism started. And I think that's really important for women to understand because we get fed a lot of lines like you should be mad at the patriarchy and men are holding you down and holding you back and women make less money than men and women are afforded less opportunity than men and we should be angry. And then you look at the divorce statistics that have dramatically increased decade over decade for the last 50 years. And there is this like inherent mistrust of male leadership. I totally get it. I grew up in a family with a broken home. Cody did as well. Ben is the one of us that got lucky and has two parents that are together, but that's not the norm. A lot of us in our millennial generation grew up with separated or divorced parents. And a lot of people just statistically don't even have good relationships with their fathers, male or female. And so knowing there is an inherent mistrust of the male leadership in our cultures today, I think personal conviction might just be that we're broken because our dad left us or our pastor failed us or a male leader in our life let us down, or even just this generalized feeling that we can't trust men because men are always out to get us and men want to hold us down and we should just shut up and look pretty and have babies and make birthday cakes and whatever. That's not the truth. And if I were to go and become ordained because I feel convicted because I don't think I can trust male leadership and I need to take that into my own hands, that's wrong. And that's what I see a lot of is you have this beautiful picture in Ephesians for how the bride of Christ is supposed to be prepared. And you have this beautiful picture of how a male should treat a woman and how a woman should treat a male. But we're not living that out. We live in this fallen world and we don't trust the system that God has in place for us in the scripture, in this love letter that he's written to us. So if we're not trusting that scripture and we're saying, no, actually, I can do better, male or female, you shouldn't be getting ordained. There's absolutely no reason to be doing that. And so evaluating your trust in males and where that comes from, read Eve in Exile. Even if you don't agree with complementarianism, read it as a woman or as a man. It will make you rethink the feminist movement and it will help you understand the political motivation behind building distrust in the family unit as well as male leadership.
I will also say the most growth that I've had in my life has been outside of the church. It's been with you, Gina, and you, Cody. I've learned a lot from a woman, but that's outside of the church hierarchy, the church leadership. I will say what it seems to me in the Bible, and as much as we can disagree about leadership and everything, whether it's for ceremonial reasons or for functional differences between men and women, whatever, setting all that aside, we see a lot of the growth in individuals happening outside of the gatherings we would have considered to be church in the New Testament. Apollos is recorded in the book of Acts as having some issues, some mistakes in his theology. He's taken aside by Aquila and Priscilla. Priscilla is the woman in that, in case you don't know. I actually had no clue who was the woman for the longest time. Is it Aquila? They both sound like female names.
And they rhyme.
They do. They were destined to be together. But no, Aquila was a Jew who had converted to Christianity, and Priscilla was his wife. They both take Apollos aside, and they speak to him and correct him on his error. A woman is involved in the correction of a man. There is a measure of authority in that. Timothy is converted by his grandmother. Paul talks with great reverence about the faith of his grandmother that now lives in him. However we think about the church itself, that should not be our focus. Our focus should not be on rising to the maximal level of influence in our church. Our focus should be on rising to the maximal level of impact with the people around us. Once again, I have learned the most I ever have in my entire life in this group right here. And we have plenty of people with some very wide-ranging beliefs on the complementarian versus patriarchal versus egalitarian, but we haven't gotten any complaints at all up to this point, as far as I'm aware, about Gina being with us and talking on this podcast.
I don't belong here.
You totally do.
This is my resignation.
No, you totally do. And keep in mind, this is coming from someone who takes the position of a complementarian. I do believe genuinely that Gina has earned her position here, that she belongs here, that the podcast would not be the same without her. And I know this also because we had a couple episodes where it was just me and Cody and we were all over the place. Like, it was crazy. Yeah, we got to talk about all the things that we wanted to, but there was like no order to anything.
No, it was pretty chaotic.
Fun, but very chaotic. So all that is to say, while there are prescriptions, I do believe, for the arrangement ceremonially, in part, of leadership in the church, there isn't for your everyday life. And you should be willing to take instruction from anyone who happens to know more than you, wherever that source of knowledge is.
One thing that I really love and respect is Cody's perspective on ordination. And I just want to ask if you'd share on that.
What? The fact that I won't?
Yeah.
Like, it's a label or position now that people chase rather than, I believe, whether you're male or female, if God is calling you into a position of leadership, you're going to be in that position whether you want to or not. I think there's too many people chasing a position that shouldn't be there, that have not been ordained by God, which is where the ordination should come from, not from a man, not from a denominational hierarchy. It should come from God. Like, your calling to be a pastor should come from God. If you're right with God, what men say, what man says, mankind says, doesn't matter. I've had too many pastors that are ordained and elders that are ordained and high priests like fail constantly. And not because, not in the sense of, oh, they're just messed up people, they're sinners like us. They should not be in the position that they're in.
We've seen it abused way too many times. I love repeating this, but you don't need a title to do ministry.
No.
And like, the piece of paper that calls you a pastor is given to you by man, not God. So you want to go teach, start a podcast. I don't know. You don't need to start a church, start a Bible study, start a life group, start just talking to people on park benches. But do not think for a second that you need to go out and get a piece of paper to say that you are a church leader, because it, at this point, in my opinion, is completely meaningless, because anybody can do it. And you shouldn't just trust anybody who's, oh yeah, I'm a pastor.
Whether you like it or not, you are a missionary. If you're a Christian, that's what you are. And whether you're male or female, that's what we are all called to do. We are all under the call of the Great Commission. And once again, Timothy is converted by his grandmother. Aquila and Priscilla are both regarded as missionaries. Eunia is an apostle. That can either mean she's in the head leadership of the church, or she was an apostle in the traditional sense, meaning she was the first one to reach a community, which is the traditional interpretation of the word, though it can mean either. Again, difficult to say. The point is that no matter what way you look at it, we are all, male or female, called to be missionaries. We have a mission.
Yep. So I would like to briefly go through some of the quotes from scholars, pastors, and church leaders and church fathers that are for and against women in leadership in the church. We've got N.T. Wright. He's an Anglican and New Testament scholar. He says, "It is high time we recognize that the Bible sees all Christian ministry as essentially collaborative and open to all the people of God, regardless of gender." We have John Stott, who is an evangelical Anglican. He said, "If God endows women with spiritual gifts, which he does, and thereby calls them to exercise their gifts for the common good, then the church must recognize God's gifts and calling and make appropriate spheres of service available to women." So he's not necessarily endorsing pastoral ministry, but he is saying that spheres of service need to be made available to women based on their gifting. And I love that quote. That personally really highlights what I believe is both male and female role in church. You exercise your gift for the common good, and then the church must recognize God's gifts and calling and make appropriate spheres of service available. That is great. There are some others. So Gordon D. Fee and Craig Keener have some quotes. I won't repeat all of them here, but I will repeat the Beth Moore quote. She is an evangelical Bible teacher. This is one of those situations where we see that emotional kind of hatred towards women in ministry. So Beth Moore, her quote is, "I did not surrender to a calling of man when I was 18 years old. I surrendered to a calling of God. It never occurred to me for a second not to fulfill it." And John MacArthur's response, who is a Reformed Baptist pastor and is against the women in church leadership, his response was, "Go home." It's just not a respectful way of speaking, whether you agree doctrinally or whatever with Beth Moore or any other female leader. I personally get really offended and hurt when men are so vocal and disrespectful about a woman who's vulnerably sharing, whether he agrees with it or not. There's a time and a place. And I just find that treating women like that is a reason that women don't trust male leadership. John MacArthur says also, when women take upon themselves the role of preacher, they open the door to chaos in the church because they subvert the order God has designed. Wayne Grudem, he's the founder of the CBMW. I can't remember what that stands for, but he says, allowing women to teach or exercise authority over men in the church directly disobeys Scripture, no matter how gifted or called a woman may feel. The president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Albert Mohler, says, "We cannot become unmoored from Scripture and still call ourselves evangelical. The Bible is clear. The teaching office is limited to qualified men." And then I did include Origen and Augustine of Hippo. Origen stated, "Even if it is granted that there are prophesying women, they are not appointed teachers of men, for the man is the head of the woman. It is not proper for a woman to speak in an assembly." And then there's two from Augustine. So one is, "The woman herself alone is not the image of God, whereas the man alone is the image of God as fully and completely as when he and the woman are joined together in one." And then there's, "Women are not to be ordained to the priesthood. This is the apostolic tradition." I really like what Augustine says, talking about the man needing the joining together with a woman to be fully in the image of God. That gets taken in weird directions sometimes, and I don't really like that. But I think it's a beautiful depiction of what Cody and I get to do together, because we are most united and most on the same page when we include God at the center of our relationship and what we do in podcasting and leading, which is to me like the cord of three strands in Ecclesiastes. So I actually really love that quote. And I do lean more complementarian, which makes me sad because most of these quotes are like very direct and like accusing.
Like I said, this is not a position I like being in as a complementarian, and this is one of the major reasons why. If a lot of the people who are a lot of the citations as scholars in this area, and they're all insufferable when it comes to this subject, and they don't have any tact or any class or any kindness or any humility in the approach of the subject, it makes it very difficult to say this is my position. And to be fair, I don't even know that I am fully the complementarian in the way that these guys are, because I point to someone like Deborah and say it's clearly not impossible. I do say it's rare. I say that the gift of leadership can be bestowed on women and men, but I do think that God does it more often in men. And again, I could be wrong on that. But already I think that's a deviation from what a lot of these men are talking about.
Yeah, true complementarianism seems to be very strict and structured. And there are very specific roles that women can fill, but they are not roles that include teaching men in any form outside of teaching alongside her husband. And then it's to complement what the husband's saying, not to really lead with the husband's support. And I don't really agree with that, but I've seen too much abuse, and I've seen too many people who should not be pastors become pastors. And I think that's why I'm so opposed to really anybody claiming leadership without like actual authority.
Yeah, the problem with egalitarian churches is it seems like they force the issue. If you're a woman, you have a higher chance of becoming ordained in a pastor. And I don't think that is accurate. Our last church seemed that way. Like they were very much about highlighting women in leadership versus making sure that they fit that role. And I think you see that forcing of women in leadership and the like full-fledged egalitarian, which I don't agree with at all.
There's so much that can be learned from studying all sides of this. And that's one of the things I loved about my education at Moody is that they did truly give me a holistic view of what everybody in the church believes. So I could make up my mind. But I don't think Moody ordains women. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that they're complementarian. So you can complete your seminary degree to a certain extent as a woman at Moody, but I don't think that they ordain women. I could be wrong. But either way, the amount of nonsense that happened in the message boards during my education was insane. And some people come up with some really crazy things. Be careful when you're having conversations about this as a woman, because you will open yourself up to be vulnerable to intense criticism and hate speech from men that is not fair and it's not right and you don't deserve it. Simultaneously, though, if you're going to be outspoken and not cautious with your words and, you're going to pridefully speak, then maybe you deserve rebuke. It's two sides to the coin. You have to be very careful. I take leadership very seriously. We say it on every single episode pretty much, but all leaders in the church are judged exceptionally harshly by God, and we do not take that lightly. And I think that's why it makes us so upset when we see the titles and offices in churches being abused, because those people are not equipped and they will be judged, and it's going to be so sad for them. It's life or death. It's not just, hey, I want to teach. Hey, I feel really convicted and I'm really good at speaking. We got an email this week from a publicist saying, hey, this lady wrote a book and do you want to have her on your podcast? This is what she can talk about. No, because that's not, I'm being honest though. Like, I'm a woman and I find it really insulting when people are like, my testimony is the reason I should be a pastor. Like, it's not. Your testimony is what builds the church. Your testimony is personally edifying and can help other people on an individual basis. And your testimony may be one of those things that happens to go viral enough that you become famous. But I can tell you that the people that I know are famous based on their testimonies do not know their Bible the way that theologians and scholars do. It's not the same thing. And women's ministry is a lot of viral pastors who shared their testimony and self-ordained, or they got endorsed by a very liberal pastor and they just go on tours and they tell their own story. That's not being a pastor. You have to have discipleship. You can't just give a speech. So,
yeah, I don't think the role of pastor is being fulfilled by too many. I don't know how many times I've been told by male pastors that, oh, I just preach. I don't shepherd the flock at all. I don't disciple. I have a discipleship pastor for that.
We have volunteers for that.
Yeah. I just preach.
And I think that you'll find for the women who deserve to be on stage, you're going to be welcomed regardless of what church it is, regardless of their position. Like Corrie ten Boom was a public speaker. She went around to dozens of countries. I don't know the exact number. I think, like 60 countries. She traveled all over the world telling her story, her testimony. I don't think there were any churches who were like, I don't know, she's a woman. That whole thing about her being around World War II, all the miracles that happened there, her sister dying and her forgiving one of the men who worked at the concentration camp. I don't know. She's a woman. Can't do it. No, everyone's like, whoa, I want a part of that. If you have something that is God-breathed, people want to have a part of it. And so suddenly all of this discussion just falls away. And what's left is the truth. They want the truth. But if you don't have that, then obviously, what are you doing? Do you really think that you have a story that's so important, that's so great, that you really need to get behind a pulpit and tell everybody about it? Or woman.
And when you consider pastors like Christine Caine, and I respect her, she makes $50,000 at almost every single speech that she gives in megachurches. Like if you look up the speaking engagements for some of these pastors that are females that go and tell their story, they're making 5 figures, like easy in giving these sermons, and it's the same one at every church. Is that really pastoral ministry when you're profiting like that and the tithe money is going to that? I don't agree with that. I think that's an abomination.
Yeah.
That makes me cry to think that the money that people are scraping together, that's preciously given to the church in trust and faith, and then it's being given like that to a person who has a cool story, but really just says the same thing over and over again and doesn't really personally respond when people reach out to them. What is that? Because that's not pastoral ministry.
No, that's entertainment. That's exactly what it is. It's a skit that has been practiced and repeated, rinse and repeat.
So I really struggle with that type of ministry. I don't really qualify it as ministry. I will say what is it from Pride and Prejudice? You're very harsh on your own sex is what they say. Like I am. Like, I don't like when I see somebody taking the Lord's name in vain through a lack of allegiance, I feel insulted for the Lord. I had a student one time. I used to lead in student ministries, and one of my students graduated high school. She joined the worship team, and she would come back and I would see her doing worship. And one of the things that happened on a weekly basis with her for a while was she would get off the stage when she was done and cry because girls and boys in the audience would be like dancing inappropriately to the worship songs or texting. And she would cry because she was so insulted at how she was like pouring out her heart in worship to the Lord and people were mocking it. And she felt that insulted, like the way that Jesus was rejected and spit on. And she felt that burden. And I feel like that when I see stuff like that in women's ministry, where it's an insult to the office of pastor and it's an insult to the office of shepherd. And I really struggle with that as a woman. And that's why I am not egalitarian, because I see it taken way in the extreme and I have no tolerance for it. I do want to share a few resources here at the end for anybody that's interested. So there's some books you can read if you would like to see some pictures of the views on women in ministries. Tim and Kathy Keller have a couple of different ministries. They write some interesting books. Kathy Keller wrote one called Jesus, Justice, and Gender Roles. I hated this book.
Tell us how you really felt.
My goodness.
I hated this book, even though she is a complementarian. I hated this book, but I'm sharing it because it is a resource used in seminary for understanding women's roles in ministry. There is another one co-authored by Sarah Sumner that I hated called Men and Women in the Church, Building Consensus on Christian Leadership. I find that Sarah Sumner is very manipulative emotionally in how she talks about women's ministry. She is complementarian as well. It's funny because I hate a lot of books written by people that I agree with. There's also another one called Two Views on Women in Ministry. It is written by two authors. I only put one. James R. Beck is the first author. There's two separate authors that wrote this book, and they both have different opinions. So one is egalitarian, one is complementarian. It's very interesting. It's a series of like essays. I did find this one to be the most interesting, but if you're looking for additional information, one book that I love is called Daughters of the Church. It's a book, the subtitle is Women and Ministry from the New Testament Times to the Present by Ruth A. Tucker and Walter Leafield. This book is great because it doesn't really outline the gender roles in ministry. It just leads by example. So you get all of the female leadership in the New Testament plus the early church forward. So you read about the different women who formed the church over the generations. You read about people like Corrie ten Boom. You read about other leaders in the church, martyrs and saints and people who did magnificent things for the Lord without any title at all. And I think that is probably my favorite example for women in ministry because it's a truly God-led ministry instead of some formal titled thing that you needed a man's approval for. And I think that's the biggest takeaway for me in my studies on women in ministry is just look for the godly examples in history. Don't look at who's shiny and new right now. Look for the people of old and be like them. Copy their behaviors. Be willing to die for your faith. Be willing to share the gospel at any cost. And be willing to do whatever it takes to perpetuate the gospel message because that is our inheritance. So the story of these women is our inheritance as women in ministry. And that is the leadership role that we should aspire to. So those are some books. that I really recommend for different viewpoints, knowing how I emotionally responded to some of them. But hopefully that's helpful. And if you guys have any questions or feedback on women in ministry, feel free to share. Just know that we're not really looking for somebody to reach out and try to change our mind. We're pretty comfortable in our convictions and beliefs, and Cody and I are both in agreement in our marriage that neither one of us are pursuing becoming ordained. And I teach alongside my husband because I find that to be the most edifying and respectful way of leading in my marriage. We love you guys and look forward to hearing from you. And if you want this outline, please reach out. We'll happily send it to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.